Who is Lydia? Well, we don't know a whole lot, but what we do know fascinates us. And I want to begin with my own experience, sort of going back through the mists of time to my own younger days. I don't actually remember first hearing the story. I more remember being aware of it. See, I grew up with this word egalitarian floating around above me, that men and women were equal and were able to do anything that one another could do. So with that as the backdrop, I remember it could have been in elementary school when we colored purple the cloth, or it could have been in high school when an intrepid Sunday school teacher introduced this to us. I don't know exactly when I first jumped into Acts 16, but I do remember this character, this biblical character, looming large over my own spiritual formation. I was struck by how this woman seemed to be at the center of responding to God's call. Because even then, even young me realized that we live in a male-dominant world. And much more so back then. I don't know that I knew that much, but I knew that we do live in one today. And so make more money, perpetuate the majority of domestic violence, and occupy the vast majority of executive, leadership, and entrepreneurial roles. There's the classic riddle. There were a father and son were in a car accident, a terrible car accident, and the accident killed the father. The son is rushed to the hospital, and just as he's about to go into surgery, the surgeon says, "I can't operate on this boy. He is my son." How is that possible? It's an old... And we don't even have an early service where they could have heard that. Did everyone hear that? The surgeon was the mother. And the reason it's a riddle is because we expected everyone, when I said the surgeon couldn't say, "I can't operate on the boy, he's my son." We all pictured a retired surgeon like Charlie or Keith. Here in Acts 16, we meet Lydia. And just like the riddle, she sort of pushes that concept of the world. She's a worshiper of God, and when she hears Paul's message of good news, she responds. And then she does one more than that. She has the whole household baptized. Talk about someone with some control or authority. She was a leader. The starring role inspires people's imagination. I have a very good friend, Steve Harris. He spoke at my ordination service. And I remember a sermon that he gave years ago about this passage. And it was absolutely inspired. And I'm really sorry he's not here today to share it with you, because it was fantastic. But one thing that he did is he told a very imaginative version of this story from Lydia's perspective. Listening to this middle-aged at that time man talk, you would actually eventually start to picture Lydia standing up in front of you. It's powerful, but one of the things he did was portrayed the whole image of it being lonely at the top, as the head of the household, the person responsible for this purple cloth industry, whatever she was doing with it. Where does it all begin? It doesn't start with Lydia sitting by the side of the river. It doesn't start with her responding. It starts with Paul and Timothy in Troas. He met Timothy in Lystra, and they left together. And in Troas, Paul has this vision. He has this idea that there's a person, a man, pleading with him to go to Macedonia. David Forney talks about visions, and he says visions are surprising things. When we talk of God's vision today in the church, we typically mean something more like strategic planning. as one step a congregation takes along the planning process. And I don't know if, when I mentioned we're going to have a visioning session, everyone says, well, first, of course, we need to pray. Then we need to be thankful that God is working in our congregation. And then step 3, after we've prayed and we've expressed our appreciation, we can discern God's vision by calling in a consultant. I mean, that's surefire way to get to God's vision is call in a consultant, and our well-conceived scripting of God's vision, if it's even that, is pretty far off from receiving from God a vision. Let me switch it around a little bit. If someone came up to you and said, I've had a vision, I venture to guess many of us, we'd probably be too polite to say what we're really thinking. Really? Really? You've had a vision? Our dubious response is in part due to the fact that there are so many people who betray other people's trust. I stayed up praying all night, and this is what I found. The Lord has told me to say this. Really, that sounds a lot more like you than the Lord. And I know you. And that's why we respond that way when somebody says, I've had a vision from God. Here we see Paul on the move, and he's focused on God, making experiencing God a priority in his daily life. And we see that over and over again in Acts. He has a vision. He's led by a man in a dream to go to Macedonia, and he sails there and preaches about Jesus. Lydia isn't the main character. God's the main character. God leads. God leads Paul to go. God leads Lydia to respond. God is still speaking today. And we would do well to listen. I'll cut right to the chase. What is God leading you to do? What is God prompting you to do this day? I would say that God is speaking to every single one of us. And if we don't hear it, it's not that God has decided to walk away and give attention to somebody else. It's more about us. We have a world around us of Macedonians. And I'm not talking about my friend Kosta Milkov, who actually is from the country of Macedonia. I'm not talking about modern Macedonia. I'm talking about the mission field that surrounds us every single day. There are children who do need to hear about God's grace. There are friends and neighbors. There are people who have, at one point, drank from the living water, like Jesus talks about in John 4. But for whatever reason, life experience at churches, they've drifted away. There is a world all around us waiting to hear God's good news and grace. Am I talking about saving souls? Not in the sense that we do something and then God reacts or blesses it. I'm talking about each one of us being available to God, about following God, listening and joining in on the work God already has going on. No one is too old. No one is too tired. No one is incapable. Every one of us is gifted. Every one of us has skills. And every one of us has opportunities. We reflect our faith. Join in God's work and show how we are transformed by Christ and let God's light shine in a world that can be somewhat dim sometimes. Now, a few chapters back, Peter had a vision in Acts 11, and this was the story of Peter and Cornelius. And that's where we first saw this boundary between the Jewish followers of Christ and the Gentiles blown away. And we see that boundary broken, and that even Gentiles who have not converted to Judaism first can become followers of the way, or Christ followers, or what we would say today as Christians. Paul's visit to Philippi widens these theological implications. Through Peter, we see that it's not just Jews who can follow. Through Paul, we see that it's not just men or people in the Middle East. when we place limits on God's grace, you know what? They are our limits. They're not God's limits. When we question and say, this can't be possible, that's my voice talking, not God's. If you remember nothing else this morning, I invite you to imagine Lydia as someone who you could not possibly imagine being a vibrant part of this faith community and family. There are people all around us who don't know the joy of being here, who don't know the joy of a babbling and sometimes a little bit crying baby. There are people who don't know the laughter of, and I saw some of you chuckle, the preacher tripping over a Bible as he tries to get out of the choir loft. You know, the thing is, I'm more thrilled that there was a massive Bible back there. I don't know whose it is and what it's doing there, but that's more exciting to me. There are people who don't know what it's like to be a part of a family of faith like this. When Paul arrives in Philippi, he arrives at a Sabbath gathering of women. And I know I've beaten this one to death, but I just want to go through this again. Suddenly, that barrier that was so prevalent in ancient culture, and even today in some places, is broken. Paul doesn't say to Lydia, and this is where I want to get back into the verses that are on the page. Paul doesn't say, hey, where are your husbands? I've got something I want to share with them. These verses are about sharing God's grace and God's love. Now, you may have heard the story before, and when I've talked about this before, I've focused some attention on what a merchant in purple fabric would do, who they'd rub shoulders with, who they'd be around. It was a fairly elite industry. Instead, I want to move ahead. Who does Paul share God's grace with next? Does anybody know? Some of you are reading ahead. That's fine. This is one of those tests that the book is always allowed. It's never a closed book test. It's a slave girl. It's a slave girl. And so we don't need to get caught up in saying, hot dog, God's called me to the rich and famous. God's called us to share grace and love with every person we encounter. What does it mean for us today? Well, I think I've covered that. We are to reflect God's light. There are opportunities to do that all the time. It starts right here in this room, in the way that we interact with one another. It starts right here, the way that we talk to one another, the way that we lift one another up in prayer when we're not around one another. It continues when we leave this room and we see people we know who may be a part of our family of faith. We don't tell them, hey, I missed you at church, so that we get to hear their excuse. We tell them we care about them. And we tell them that we miss them in such a way that they just know we just missed them. This calling, it continues. I know not everybody's called to serve in Vacation Bible School. There are opportunities. Paul didn't wait for a process. Paul, nowhere in Acts does it mention that he called in a consultant. Nowhere does it mention committees and things like that. We have good policies in place, and those all are there for a reason, and they make sense. But we should always, and every single day, be open to the leading of the Holy Spirit. And so when we consider visions, and we consider where God is leading us to go, and what God is calling us to do, we should be open to wherever that takes us. And you know, it may take you outside of your comfort zone. It may take you, as we've been talking about on Wednesday nights, to a place where you're seeking to be a peacemaker in a way that you had never thought about before. But wherever it takes you, if you're there because God is led, I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt, you will be blessed. You will be blessed.